Welcome back, chameleons, to my channel of Aspie Answers as your host, Aspie Answers, as well as your advocate, navigator, navigating through life with autism and mental health, along with taking you all on a journey with autism and mental health when I'm able, so that if you're into any of these and more that I share with you on the daily, or now hopefully maybe 3 days a week, depending, as I said, keep your eye out. Feel free to smash that subscribe button on the bottom right hand corner, and when you do so, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future posts that I post, and support me in any way you can. Welcome back, chameleons. This is a guideline supplementary paper that was written by the New Zealand Autism Spectrum Disorder group of the Insight Research Limited group, as well as in saying this is going to be the implications of the DSM5 for the Diagnosis of Autism Spectrum Disorder. Based on this report is dedicated to the memory of one of the colleagues and friends of the late Joanna Curzon, who was the instrumental in the development of New Zealand Autism Spectrum Guideline and establishing and supporting the living guideline process. And this report was published in 2014, basically with 25th of March, which obviously the Ministry of Health here in New Zealand also helped with this, as well as many others. So basically, as you're aware, based on what I'm sharing with you all today, the New Zealand Autism Spectrum Disorder Guideline was published in April 2008. Like most of the DSM5 manuals all around the globe, this is to ensure that the guideline remains current in the light of emerging research, a living guideline process that was then clearly established in 2009. The living guideline process aims to regularly update the guideline to reflect new evidence and changing user needs that are autistics. A multidisciplinary team of advisors known as the Living Guidance Group here in New Zealand prioritise areas for update and revised guideline recommendations after careful consideration of a critical review of the evidence. For the current update topic, a review of evidence undertaken by Insight Research and the revised guideline recommendations are presented here, hopefully, as I'm presenting to you today as a report to the original ASD guide. This document may need to be read in context of the guidelines recommendations, which hopefully I'll link into the description, as well as many other information that I have been sharing with you. This has also been funded by New Zealand's Ministry of Health and sponsored by the Ministry of Education. So the summary of DSM5 changes to the diagnosis of ASD here in New Zealand, the differences to the diagnostic criteria relating to autism spectrum between DSM5 TR and DSM5 are summarized in table 1.1, which hopefully later today, while I'm doing this, I'll put this up as a diagram in above years for you so that you can have clear understanding as well based on this inside a video, but more on that later. But as I said, changes are as follows. The previous version of the manual distinguished conditions as separate subtypes, including autistic disorder, Aspergers disorder, or classically known as Aspergers Syndrome, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder, not otherwise specified, or PD and OS. However, the new version of the DSM5 subsumes these conditions under a single diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Subtypes are no longer clearly specified, which I clearly mentioned about also how Aspergers Syndrome is not really a diagnosis anymore, which hopefully I'll find a way to link it through this podcast as well as inside my video for you guys to follow. The criteria, also previously organised into 3 symptom domains, are now presented only under 2. They are 1. Social communication and social interaction, and 2. Restricted repeated patterns of behaviour, interest and or activity. The number of symptoms within the domains has been streamlined from 12 to 7 for a diagnosis of ASD. All 3 criteria on the social communication domain must be present, and 2 of the 4 criteria in the restricted interest domain must be met to be clearly diagnosed with this. Notably though, however, behaviours don't have to be currently present. They may be present only in history, such as observed in childhood, as well as something the sensory behaviours, hypo and hyperreactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment, absent from the DSM5 criteria for ASD, are now included under the restrictive repetitive patterns of behaviours domain. Dimensional elements, however, have been introduced, like how much a condition affects an individual, its severity levels, which I have talked about the 3 different levels of autism to understand, which again I'll really list it in the description below, either through the podcast or the video as you're following along with. In terms of also in saying this, to broadly indicate how much support a person needs and what areas of function, just to summarize it all up about that. Clinical specifiers, however, has been introduced to help describe accompanying difficulties and need for supports, including the intellectual ability, language impairment, and also co-occurring medical conditions. Delays in language will affect an individual's clinical presentation, but it's not a dividing diagnostic autism spectrum criterion. The requirement that symptoms may be evident could be before the age of 36 months old. However, that has been removed and replaced with a more open definition of present in the early developmental period. Close, open and close quotes. A new ASD criterion, however, requires that the constellation of symptoms together must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of the current functioning of an autistic. Another new ASD criterion requires that these disturbances aren't explained by alternative diagnosis diagnosis of intellectual disability or global developmental delay. Diagnosis of comorbidities including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD as it's abbreviated to. Stereotypes, movement disorder and psychiatric conditions like anxiety states and schizophrenia are now permitted with ASD. A new condition called social communication pragmatic disorder or CD I should say, correction, has been included. This applies where someone exhibits the social communication and interaction aspects of an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis but doesn't show restricted repetitive behaviours or pattern of the behaviour, interests or activities. The DSM-5 advises that people who already have a definitive diagnosis of autistic disorder, Aspergers disorder or Aspergers Syndrome again or EDD and OS will continue to retain a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Even though I would like to click before I continue this supplementary report findings of what I found. I want to ask you if any one of you were diagnosed with Aspergers syndrome or was removed out of the DSM-5. How do you feel about it? Do you feel it should have still been included in the DSM-5? Even though we know basically in the ICD 11 or 12 version of the diagnosis criteria under the intervention controls of diseases and what have you, they may be looking at maybe revisiting it and adding it back in. But again, as I said, I would love you guys to put somewhere in amongst this, so on and so forth, so that we can actually have a conversation here. So as we know, basically until high quality prospective trials are published, assessment tools are finalized and validated, and clinicians begin to apply the new criteria prospectively, many of the questions about clinical use and impact of the prevalence of ASD may remain uncertain today. This is particularly the case for new disorder of social pragmatic communication disorder, as DSM-5 is intended to be a living document. Revisions anticipated were justified by new research for the clinicians or whoever that has clinically diagnosed the patient. DSM criteria, however, provides the foundation for the development of the diagnostic tools which require revision, development and validation in light of the DSM-5. However, it is also important to recognize that ultimately clinical judgment requires a global assessment of whether someone has symptoms which cause impairment to their everyday function. So obviously, as I said, you'll see above me some of the diagrams of the summary advice and new recommendations. Hopefully, given the DSM-5 changes to the criteria for diagnosis of ASD outlined below or above me, some revisions to the recommendations are necessary, which again, as I said, will be listed or shown. The background of the diagnostic classification systems: autism can be diagnosed by medical tests of biological markers, but it's determined clinically through the observation of behavioral features meeting explicit diagnostic criteria. These are detailed in formal classification systems, including the American Association or what have you of the Diagnostic of the Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, obviously, and obviously the worldwide organization known as World Health Organization. International Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, again abbreviated down to ICD. The DSM sets out the symptoms and definitions of open quote close quote mental disorders that are recognized by the psychiatric profession and serves as a reference handbook for clinicians in the United States as well as throughout the world. It provides the standard language for clinicians, researchers and public health officials to communicate about mental health disorders. The manual is extremely influential in guiding clinical diagnoses, treatment plans, medication choices and protocols, insurance reimbursements and research agenda. Another classification system, the ICD, currently as of the 10th edition, because there'll be another one released sometime soon, is favoured in Europe and the UK for clinical diagnoses and reimbursement purposes, and involves the complication of national and international health statistics. In New Zealand alone, however, whilst the ICD is used in generating statistical records, most clinicians use DSM in practice for diagnostic classification, including psychiatrists. However, both in practice, both of these classification systems appear to be employed by mental health nurses, and there's variability in use in primary care due to their complexity and a lack of familiarity with them. But however, in December 2012, the American Psychiatric Association Board of Trustees approved the latest and 5th edition of the DSM-5, officially debuting in May 2013 at the APA's annual convention. The DSM-5 replaces the previous version of the DSM-4 and its text version, DSM-4-TR, which were used to define autism spectrum disorder in the New Zealand ASD guideline. In the guideline, ASD is used as an umbrella term, as I mentioned so many times before, to refer to a range of pervasive developmental disorders across the autism spectrum that affects communication, social interaction, and adaptive behaviour functioning. Controversy and release of the DSM-5. A major change in the DSM-5 is the reclassification of autism as a single spectrum disorder without distinct subtypes such as EDD and OS, CDD, and Aspergers Syndrome. This has attracted much attention in the academic advocacy and public medias. Fears have been raised that the DSM-5 will exclude from the diagnosis of ASD many people previously meeting the criteria, thereby cutting them off from services and the support that they need. One researcher concluded emotively that abandoning criteria that have been in worldwide use for decades, the DSM-5 is neither scientifically or morally justified. Alarming media headlines, petitions opposing the changes in an Occupy APA protest contributed and responded to a public perception that a change in nomenclature may lead to the actual disappearance of conditions such as Aspergers Syndrome, as I mentioned earlier before about this, how it's no longer diagnosed. Issues has also been raised about the independence of work group members and an alleged influence of pharmaceutical companies and concerns about confidentiality clause. On the revisions themselves, the British Psychological Society called for a paradigm shift away from the use of outdated disease models to classify clusters of symptoms as distinct disorders. In the absence of biological markers, the definition of mental disorders in the DSM continues to be refined, debated and tested. Amidst these passionate discussions, the APA has advised that the DSM-5 should be considered a living document which will be revised online following its publication. So basically, the DSM-5 criteria for diagnosing ASD subtypes. Autism was first officially recognised in the 3rd edition of the DSM, which was published in the year of 1980. In the latest revision of the 4th edition, however, of the manual DSM-4 or A sort of thing, pervasive developmental disorders consists of the 5 subtypes, which are your autistic disorder, Rett's disorder, childhood degenerative disorder, Asperger's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder, neither otherwise specified. The term autism spectrum disorder has commonly come to refer to these PDD, with the exception of Rett's disorder and sometimes CDD. Details of the criteria for ASD in the DSM-5 TR or 4TR are presented hopefully in Appendix 3, but I'll link this whole finding of my report to you guys, hopefully, shall we say, in my description so you can follow through. So as we know, basically, in the subtypes subsumed under a single diagnosis right now, in the DSM-5, 4 PDD subcategories specified in DSM-5 of autistic disorder, Asperger's Syndrome, childhood degenerative disorder, and pervasive developmental disorders not otherwise specified are now subsumed into the one broad category of ASD. The subtype terms will no longer be used diagnostically under the DSM-5. The PDD subtype Rett's disorder syndrome is excluded from the new ASD category. This is because of the DSM focuses on disorders that can be defined behaviorally without a molecular or biological test. Rett's syndrome is a single gene neurological disorder in which those with the condition may go through a phase of social impairment, language regression, and repetitive motor mannerisms resembling autism. Terminology has also changed so much dramatically over the years, as I said earlier in one of my disclaimers, so we need to be in mind though. The name pervasive developmental disorder has now been changed to autism spectrum disorder or ASD. Term mental retardation, basically now, since it has been kind of a term that has actually made the autistics and anyone else with that terminology feel real grossed out, has been replaced with the term intellectual disabilities. Combining communication and social interaction domains. A further key change is that the 3 behavioural domains specified in the DSM-4 TR, impairments in social interaction, deficits in communication, and restrictive repetitive stereotypical patterns of behaviour, interests and activities are now collapsed into the 2 domains. For example, a triad of impairments. In the first, communication and social interaction has been combined as social communication or social reciprocity, but I have clearly introduced to you guys about the DSM-5 explained, which I'll link again in hopefully the description, versus also just what have you. So you may be wondering, basically the symptoms, a number of criteria or the number of symptoms within the domains has been streamlined from 12 to 7. For diagnosis of ASD, all 3 criteria on the social communication domain must be met and 2 of the 4 criteria in the restricted interest domain must be present. Typically, behaviours in this domain don't have to be currently present, they may have present only in history, as I said before. So sensory abnormalities, unusual sensitivities to sensory stimuli wasn't considered a core feature of autism in the previous DSM versions, but are now in the DSM-5 they are included as a diagnostic symptom within the restricted repetitive patterns of behaviour and interest and activities domain. Symptoms severe dimensional elements has been introduced, which has given an indication of how much a condition affects an individual. This will help identify how much support and in what areas of function an individual needs, as I said before, in understanding the 3 levels of the actual DSM-5 or autism in itself. This will aim to better capture the spectrum nature of the disorder and reflect individual variations with respect to intensity and duration of symptoms, degree of impairment, and the distress they cause. Under the DSM-5, the diagnosis is accompanied by an indication of the level of symptom severity, graded according to the level of support required. Both language levels and intellectual functioning are important detriments of severity levels, as in the coding guide. Basically, there is a 3-point scale basically that follows, as I mentioned before, this understanding the 3 levels of autism, which 1 is mild, which will require support, 2 is moderate, requiring substantial support, and then the third one is severe, requiring very substantial support, which I'm gonna hopefully have an illustration above me in my video so that you can understand it if you haven't also seen it in the video in itself, understanding the 3 levels of autism. I'll link it in the card above me as well so you can follow through. So obviously the symptom onset, an additional change in the DSM-5 is the removal of the requirement that symptoms be evident before the age of 36 months. As I said, the criterion for symptom onset has been extended with a more open definition, such as that symptoms must be present in the developmental period, but they may not become fully manifested until social demands exceed limited capacities, or only be masked by learned strategies and like impairment of functioning. A new criterion, however, also, which is the criterion D, has been added to the diagnosis of ASD, such that the constellation of symptoms together must cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. Ruling out the alternative diagnosis, however, a final criterion, which is criterion E, has noted that intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder or global developmental delay may be fitted explanations for behavioural disturbances observed in order to apply comorbid diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. It is specified that social communication should be below that expected for general developmental levels. So the comorbidities under the DSM-4 are: a person couldn't be diagnosed together with the other condition, including attention deficit hyperactivity, ADHD, stereotype movement disorder, and psychiatric conditions such as anxiety states and schizophrenia. This limitation has now been removed again from the DSM-5 along many themes. So obviously, as it has been known, social pragmatic communication disorder is a new disorder category outside of the autism spectrum that has been created, called the social pragmatic communication disorder. There are 2 differentiating factors in diagnosing SCD or the ASD. First of all, children with social communication disorder must have persistent difficulties in pragmatics and or the social use of verbal and non-verbal communication and natural comprehension. In natural context, as I said, should say. Furthermore, these would have to impair interpersonal relationships and social comprehension that can't be explained by having more basic language difficulties. Example, deficits in sentences, structure, grammar, or general cognitive ability or intellectual disability. To meet the criteria for this diagnosis, deficits in social communication also needs to be evaluated as significantly and negatively influencing communication, social involvement, academic achievement, or occupational performance. Second of all, the presence of fixated interests and repetitive behaviours is an exclusionary criterion for social communication disorder. The presence of repetitive behaviours is therefore crucial for the differential diagnosis of ASD. Changes to diagnostic classification of ASD in the DSM-5. Based on this report findings, basically this will describe the findings of the review from the APA or DSM-5 based on the changes to diagnostic classification relevant to ASD and a discussion of potential areas of impact. So basically the rationale for changes to diagnostic criteria, the rationale for the changes to the ASD criteria is summarized as a key source for this is a commentary by Francesca Harpe of 2011, who wrote a report, who was a member of the DSM-5 Neurodevelopmental Disorders group that is responsible for the revisions that is relevant to ASD. Autism as a single spectrum disorder. The change to subsuming several PDD subtypes into a single diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5 reflects a widespread consensus that autism is best considered as existing on a spectrum with variable manifestations across the lifespan, gender, and intellectual level and or language ability of the child. This perspective is already consistent with the terminology that is used in the New Zealand ASD guidelines that is clearly mentioned. By folding Aspergers Syndrome, PDD, and OS into the category of autism spectrum disorder, the DSM-5 aims to produce a clearer and simple diagnostic system with improved recognition and diagnosis for those on the autism spectrum across all ages and ability levels. The main objective of the revision to the DSM relating to ASD was to increase the specificity of diagnosis that make it more easier to identify ASD or distinguished from other non-autistic disorders, and to increase the stability of diagnosis over time. Having a single diagnostic entirety avoids the problem of an individual receiving serial or sometimes concurrent diagnosis of PD and OS, autism and Aspergers Syndrome, depending on the clinician they see, or maturation. Numerous studies have reported correlative differences between autism spectrum disorder and Aspergers disorders subtypes. Diagnostic accuracy. A key goal in developing diagnostic criteria for classifying a disorder is to make the criteria sensitive enough to diagnose those who have a disorder and specific enough to exclude those who don't. Comparisons with ideally an independent gold reference standard permit reports a diagnostic accuracy in the form of sensitivity and specificity. Sensitivity is the ability to the test to identify correctly those who have the condition, and the specificity is the ability of the test to identify correctly those who don't have the condition. So it's a bit of mixed, opposite attract there. There has been a good deal of research activity across several countries investigating the diagnostic outcomes of the new, or in most cases proposed, diagnostic changes presented in the DSM-5 relating to ASD. The research has also been driven by concerns that the DSM-5 criteria are tighter and will lead to a reduction in the number of people receiving a diagnosis of ASD compared with the DSM-5, particularly those who are higher functioning and verbally abled. Alternatively, it has been suggested that more people may meet the criteria of ASD than ever before, because the diagnosis is now based on not just on current symptoms but on individuals' history, and there is a new criterion relating to sensory abnormalities not present in the previous versions of the DSM. People who already have an established diagnosis, there has been widespread reports of family anxiety about the removal of subtypes such as Aspergers Syndrome, the possible need for a re-diagnosis. The diagnosis of ASD can be a particularly difficult process to come by, with long waits, challenging systems, and a series of formal evaluative steps that are required. Obviously, as we know from memory, that for many of us, when we go through a diagnostic stages of ASD or anything, when we want to find out our diagnoses, therefore it has clearly shown that obviously resources are limited in certain areas of the world versus also other many means of what I've just clearly mentioned of the diagnosis for ASD. Understandably, some families are concerned about the idea of revisiting, as I said, or reopening the diagnostic process if they were to choose to do so. The US Autism Society, however, strongly advocated for people with ASD maintaining access to existing services and waiting list positions. Concerned about the impact on special education programs for those already diagnosed with ASD who may no longer fill the DSM-5 criteria led to the addition of a note in the manual under the description of the diagnostic criteria. Individuals with a well-established DSM-5 diagnosis of autism spectrum, of autistic disorder, Aspergers disorder, or pervasive developmental disorder, otherwise specified, should be given the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. This addition has been criticized as a bizarre twist from the perspective of diagnostic logic by grandfathering in people currently being treated regardless of whether they are satisfied with the current criteria. This approach nevertheless conforms to earlier calls prior to the DSM-5's publication that the diagnostic criteria has been used prospectively and that people not be formally re-diagnosed unless there is some clinical reason to do so. In such cases, it could be explained to individuals and their families that the field has moved toward thinking of the ASD difficulties along a continuum with which distinct diagnostic boundaries that persist over time don't clearly exist. Whilst the DSM-5 impacts on the clinical diagnosis, it's important to recognise the value of a diagnosis within a cultural, social and service context. This particularly applies to Aspergers Syndrome, where the term may not or may continue to be used inside such as in a DSM-5 label for many patients that has been clearly diagnosed with this, regardless of whether it's retained as a clinical diagnosis or not. This is obviously discussed in the next section and I'm about to bring out to you its cultural implications. Since the announcement in February 2010 of the proposals to remove PDD subtypes such as Aspergers Syndrome as a distinct disorder in the DSM-5, there has been extensive discussion among many stakeholders, including clinicians, scientists, advocacy groups and policy makers, but particularly among those most likely to be affected are the people with the diagnosis themselves, or the ones that are actually self-identifying themselves with Aspergers Syndrome. Neurodiversity. This term neurodiversity was coined in the late 1990s, however, for the already existing concept whereby members of the autistic community, together with self-advocates representing other developmental conditions such as ADD, attention deficit disorder and dyslexia, promoted and celebrated their differences from the neurotypical peers as a positive identity, not necessarily a disability. The concept of neurodiversity considered a typical neurological development to be normal human difference that should be accepted and respected just as other differences such as those defined by class, gender or race are or should be. From this perspective, however, autism is considered not something to be cured but rather a way of being with both disadvantages, needing accommodation, and advantages that can make a unique and positive contribution to everyday society. Since the addition of the Aspergers Syndrome diagnosis in DSM-5, a distinct subculture has emerged of the people with Aspergers Syndrome, some of whom self-refer to themselves as Aspies, and I'm clearly one of them, to admit, embraces their neurological difference. Even though, as we know, many people, as I said before in one of the videos, as well as in my podcast maybe somewhere, about how there is a first person language versus also maybe what we wish to be called. Do we want to be called autistics, holistics and what have you? But again, that will be listed in the description box below me, as well as hopefully inside the video and the podcast to come. It has also been clearly suggested that this independent culture relies upon a restrictive view of high functioning autism as being distinct from others on the spectrum, and so whilst autism conditions associated with the lower functioning may be considered disorders requiring treatment, the high functioning characteristics of Aspergers Syndrome shouldn't be pathologized as a disorder and subsumed under that category of autism spectrum disorder in the DSM. Obviously, however, some in the autistic community have an appearance of being classified as either high functioning or low functioning, rather than those diagnosed or self-diagnosed identifying anywhere on the spectrum, I'm welcome and accommodated. So again, as I said before, this is a bit of a controversial topic also, just to bear in mind about some of these classical terminologies I'm sharing with you all today, especially for the ones that are maybe listening that are autistics. I humbly apologise to you all in advance once again, based on my findings and research of the terms that we agreed not to have those labels, high functioning versus low functioning. But as I said, just to keep your comments to a minimum and what have you, and just, you know, share your thoughts and what have you, and just be kind to everyone below you of the actual comments that is thrown down there. So identity. For many people with Aspergers Syndrome, as with autism disorder, more broadly, the diagnosis has come after many years of anxiety and confusion and reputation of a turning point in their lives. Frequently, individuals who are diagnosed in adolescence or adulthood report that receiving a diagnosis results in a conceptual framework that helps explain past experiences, creates greater self-understanding, leads to informal support and awareness of additional service options readily available, hopefully. Disclosing the diagnosis can have pitfalls, however, and is best approached with care. People who don't seek a formal diagnosis, however, the desire to self-identify as having Aspergers Syndrome or ASD and to join the AS or ASD community groups may be driven by the understanding, acceptance and support that much so a community can offer. Alongside the growing professional recognition and debate around Aspergers Syndrome before and since its inclusion in the DSM5, awareness of Aspergers Syndrome and autism more generally is becoming a part of the mainstream culture, facilitated by public awareness initiatives and fictional media portrayals of the past few decades. Classic ones, for example, is Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory and the title characters in House and more. But you got to remember some of these also of the media representations of what autism Aspergers is like may be false, even though we know that probably there are going to be, hopefully in the future, I pray and hope, some media representation probably about autism, male and female, probably hearsay, but it could be slowly doing it, but not much at this point of time, I believe anyways. Just to be in mind also, linking autism to famous intellectuals and innovative thinkers contributes to view of people with AS as a group of highly intelligent, highly successful individuals making positive contributions to society. Embracing these positive images have been made people who are diagnosed, self-diagnosed or associated with themselves with AS who have developed a positive identity of Aspergers beyond the diagnostic bound. However, an extreme emphasis on positives also has their negative ramifications, such as instances of subcultures promoting Aspie supremacy that cause other individuals with autism, including with many with AS, further isolation, disadvantage and or stigma, which is one of the pitfalls. A study has included interviews with 19 adults with Aspergers Syndrome and analysed using grounded theory illustrates how the diagnosis and self-diagnosis of AS is fused with a strong and positive individual identity. For some diagnosed with AS, being labelled autistic and associated people at the lower end of the autism spectrum is problematic and potentially stigmatising. The negative stereotypes, however, placed on autism may stem from lack of understanding among the general public of those variability and symptoms among people on the autism spectrum. And Jasma and Weisland suggested that those with Aspergers Syndrome who are able to live independent lives in the right environment may find the notion of the condition being combined with lower functioning autism in the DSM-5 also even worse stigmatisation. It suggested that instead of being labelled using deficit-based language, such people should be considered as having a particular vulnerability. A well-known guide by the name of Tony Atwood, who's an Australian researcher or what have you, as well as a psychologist specialises in working with people with AS, believes the new criteria may create further social confusion for everyone around. The problem isn't the condition but the attitude of other people. He quotes, "When you're young, self-esteem is created within a peer group, not from mum or dad. Teenagers may worry that their peers have an idea of autism. The public may see autism as a severe disability. People may think the person is lying, deluded or what have you, and that if they even just say that they are autistic." It has been hypothesized though, however, under the DSM-5 criteria, a perceived stigma attached to autism may inhibit disclosure and self-identification with Aspergers Syndrome, and as a result cut off attendant benefits of diagnosis, including the development of meaningful self-identities and gaining legitimacy. Such stigma by association stems from negative stereotypes placed on autism and lack by understanding by the general public about the variability and symptoms among people on the autism spectrum. Dispelling stigma around autism would be nice, ensuring balanced information upon diagnosis and providing well-informed support for those on the spectrum, and as well as around the disclosure are likely to assist in addressing issues around these. The ASD guideline includes a recommendation relating to stigma, and ASD anti-discrimination and destigmatization should be developed. In conclusion, to end this hopefully supplementary research findings that I have found for you guys. This review updates evidence for the New Zealand Autism Spectrum Disorder Guideline with respect to the diagnostic classification of Asd in view of the latest version of the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM5 as it's clearly known. As I said, following the presence of database search and reference checking of research published since 2004, 123 articles were retrieved as a full text and 93 were found to be directly relevant to the review scope. In addition, the dedicated DSM5 website and those of prominent autism advocacy, research and support organisations were searched for position statements and featured in this commentaries. These provide additional background and context to controversial changes to the classification of Asd and the receptor. The literature considered for this review is substantial given the targeted nature of the search and the recency of publication of the DSM5. It's likely that some articles pertinent to the broader issues relating to the diagnosis of Asd has been clearly missed. However, given the extensive reference checking and website searching involved, it's likely that any key influential studies missed in searching would have been subsequently identified. Autism has been considered a spectrum condition for many years as recognised in the New Zealand Asd Guideline. The rationale behind the revisions, however, of the clinical manual is evidence-based, supported by a rigorous, transparent and consultative development and process by an international team and extending over many years. Preliminary indications of clinical utility are positive. In DSM5 field trial, interraterability appears to be good, although the sample for Asd diagnosis was small and verifying in broader populations. The criteria appear to be acceptable and feasible trials and routine practices, at least for motivated participants following significant online training. Whilst the DSM5 criteria were publicly released only on a matter of months ago at the time of the write-up, considerable research has already been published relating to the diagnostic yield of the new Asd criteria compared to the previous version. Since 2011, 14 such studies have been published representing a diverse range of samples and approaches. Comparing diagnosis under DSM-4 TR criteria, studies has suggested improved specificity for DSM-5, leading to fewer people without Asd being mistakenly diagnosed with the condition, but somewhat reduced sensitivity ranging widely from 46 to 95%. Interpretation is hampered by methodological differences and limitations, particular reliance on existing datasets for determining DSM-5 diagnoses retrospectively from medical notes and symptom checklists. Also problematic other imperfect attempts access the DSM-5 criteria by mapping them to responses to items designed to inform diagnosis under the DSM-5. A large study, however, of over 5,000 children and young people using best estimate clinical diagnosis found that a high majority, 91% of people diagnosed with an Asd under DSM-4 TR criteria identified retrospectively would retain a diagnosis of Asd when diagnosed according to the DSM-5 criteria. Of course, these results are reassuring given the limitations of the study's conduct date. The true sensitivity and specificity of DSM-5 criteria for Asd remains unclear as the impact on prevalence of Asd. These determine sensitivity and specificity of either diagnostic system. Large population-based prospective field trials are needed to use an independent reference standard and concurrent assessment using two symptoms blinded to the comparison diagnosis. It's understood that two large population-based trials are currently underway which aim to investigate prevalence under the two DSM versions more robustly. DSM criteria provide the foundation for the development of diagnostic tools which require revision, development and validation in the light of the DSM-5. However, it's important to recognise that ultimately clinical judgment requires a global assessment of whether someone has symptoms which cause impairment to their everyday functioning as mentioned. Till high quality prospective trials are published, assessment tools are finalised and validated and clinicians begin to apply the new criteria prospectively, many of the questions about clinical use and impact on prevalence of Asd will remain uncertain. This is particularly the case for the new disorder of visual pragmatic communication disorder. As DSM-5 is intended to be a living document, revisions are anticipated where justified by new research through the process for this is currently unclear. As DSM-5 is introduced, there will be an ongoing involvement of key stakeholders to ensure that individuals with Asd and families have strong voices as diverse systems grapple with potential changes in diagnostic classification. The APA states that those currently with a well-established diagnostic of autistic disorder, Aspergers disorder or PDNOS be given the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder as mentioned earlier, regardless of the changes to the classification of Asd and what is fundamentally a diagnosis clinical manual. Individuals may choose to refer to themselves using their own terms to belonging to a culture that just transcends into their diagnoses. Also, where to find me? This again will be listed in the socials, but just to tell you right now is Facebook is my Aspie Answers, my Twitter again will be Aspie Answers, which
They're both capital A. Spotify obviously is Aspie Answers, which is capital A, capital A. Is my crowdfunding page right now. You can find me on patreon.com, Aspie Answers, basically. And for those of you who don't know what Patreon is, today, for those who are listening that are new, I have this set up for funding for future projects like this one of my podcast versus my merch that I've been designing, which I'll share more briefly soon about my merch update, or even in this podcast right now as I'm addressing this to you guys, is that it's like a crowdfunding page or funding page for creators like me, or content creators, music creators, whoever it may be that's seeking out funding to support themselves in a way of, maybe say they need extra equipment for their cameras versus maybe their radio equipment if they were doing something similar like I am doing today, or covering their rent, travel costs, what have you. And in saying this, also basically for the merch, you'll see me basically maybe wearing it once in a while on my YouTube channel, as well as maybe, you know, out and about in public. And so in saying this, my merch site is spreadshirt.com, life-of-an-Aspie. And another one you can find me on my social is for those who haven't and I like to read instead of watching or what have you, as an alternative for you guys, is lifeofanasbieweb.wordpress.com. So this wraps up everything. I want to thank you all for listening right now. Follow me on the socials that were listed below. Subscribe, share this podcast to friends and family. You know, if you want to, feel free to become a Patreon to support this future project, as well as many others that is in the works as of this time. Feel free to, you know, donate big or small with me in this journey of it. And also my merch obviously will cover the cost for this as well. So I'll catch you all again on the other side. Aspie signing out for now, and bye.